A pastor vanished without a trace in 1979, leaving his congregation and family searching for answers. But 40 years later, a fisherman makes a discovery underwater, and what he finds changes everything. The dawn of June 17, 1979, brought with it the promise of a special day for the Washington family. As the summer sun began to gild the streets of the Oakwood neighborhood in Birmingham, Alabama, Eliza Washington was already up, preparing a special breakfast. In the dining room of the family's modest home, a graduation robe hung carefully on the closet door, awaiting its moment. "James, have you reviewed your speech?" Eliza asked as she served pancakes to their 3 teenage children, Michael, 17, Sarah, 15, and Joshua, 13. Reverend James Washington, 42, pastor of New Hope Baptist Church and newly minted Doctor of Theology from the University of Alabama, adjusted his thick-framed glasses and smiled over his coffee cup. "For the 5th time since last night, yes, dear." To the residents of Oakwood, a predominantly black neighborhood still feeling the lingering effects of segregation, Reverend Washington represented much more than a spiritual leader. He was a symbol of hope and progress. Graduated with honors from Morehouse College, his recent doctoral achievement was a source of pride for the entire community, especially in a state where racial tensions remained palpable even after the advancements of civil rights. "Dad, do you think you'll be in the newspaper?" asked Joshua, the youngest, as he attacked his pancakes. "It's not about being in newspapers, son," James replied with the calm, deep voice his parishioners so admired. "It's about showing that knowledge and education are paths open to all of us." New Hope Baptist Church, under his leadership for the past 12 years, had transformed into a pillar of the community. Beyond the Sunday services that gathered about 300 faithful, the church maintained a food bank, evening literacy classes, and a scholarship program that had already sent 7 young people from the community to college, achievements that the Reverend celebrated more than his own doctorate. At 1:30 in the afternoon, James kissed Eliza and promised to be back in time for dinner. "I'll be home around 7. After the ceremony, I plan to stop by Lake Martin to organize my thoughts for tomorrow's sermon." It was a known habit of the family. The Reverend frequently sought the tranquility of the lake's viewpoint for his reflections and spiritual preparation. The ceremony at the University of Alabama was a memorable event. As one of the few black speakers ever invited in the institution's history, James delivered an eloquent speech on reconciliation and integration, emphasizing that churches should lead the way to a truly integrated society. Among the predominantly white audience, some uncomfortable expressions contrasted with the enthusiastic applause of the majority. After the ceremony, around 5 o'clock, Reverend Washington was seen talking with the Dean of Theology, Dr. William Harrison. "That was a courageous speech, James," Harrison commented. "Not everyone is ready to hear these truths, but they need them." "Truth is rarely comfortable, Bill," James replied, shaking his colleague's hand. "See you at next month's symposium." This was the last time anyone known saw James Washington alive. At 7:30, Eliza began to grow restless. Dinner, fried chicken, James's favorite, was cooling on the table. Calls to the dean's office went unanswered, and James's pager remained silent. Michael, the oldest son, suggested that his father might be stuck in traffic or that the ceremony had run long. At 9 o'clock, Eliza called Deacon Thomas Wilson, James's right-hand man at the church. "Thomas, James hasn't returned from the ceremony. This isn't like him." Wilson, knowing the Reverend's habitual punctuality, immediately offered to check the route to Lake Martin, where James often stopped to meditate. "I'll take a look and call you back in an hour, Eliza. I'm sure he's fine." The night advanced with agonizing slowness for the Washington family. At 10:45, the phone rang. Wilson's voice was trembling. "Eliza, I found James's car at the Viewpoint parking lot. He's not there. His glasses are on the dashboard and the driver's door is ajar. His robe is folded in the back seat." Eliza's heart froze. James would never go anywhere without his glasses. His vision was too poor. "Did you call the police?" she asked, trying to maintain her composure in front of the children who were watching her with alarmed eyes. "I'm calling from a payphone right here. They're on their way." When Eliza arrived at the scene, accompanied by Michael, it was already past midnight. 3 police cruisers were parked with flashing lights, illuminating James's navy blue Chevrolet Impala in intermittent flashes. Sergeant Dave Mullins, a middle-aged white officer, was coordinating an initial search of the viewpoint area. "Mrs. Washington, when was the last time you spoke to your husband?" Mullins asked, jotting in his notepad. "Before he left for the ceremony, around 1:30 in the afternoon," Eliza replied, her voice breaking as she looked at her husband's empty car. Dawn brought the mobilization of the community. More than 50 members of New Hope Baptist Church voluntarily gathered to start searches around the lake area. The Birmingham Police Department assigned 2 teams to the case, a decision that positively surprised the family, given the era and the racial context of the region. "We're treating this as a high-risk disappearance," explained Detective Frank Miller, a white veteran nearing retirement who took on the case. "Reverend Washington is a respected figure in the community, and there is absolutely no indication that he would have reasons to disappear voluntarily." The first days of searches revealed few clues. Teams with tracking dogs scoured the viewpoint area and the shores of the lake. Divers from the fire department examined the waters near the parking lot. But Lake Martin, with its depths exceeding 300 feet in some places and more than 700 miles of irregular shoreline, presented significant challenges for a complete search. Meanwhile, theories began to circulate. For most members of the black community, the possibility of a racially motivated crime was evident, especially after the progressive speech at the university. Some officers, however, leaned toward the accident hypothesis. Perhaps James had slipped on the steep rocks near the viewpoint and fallen into the lake. On the 4th day after the disappearance, a witness emerged. Arnold Pickett, a local fisherman, reported having seen a black man, who could be the Reverend, talking with 2 white men in the parking lot around 6 o'clock that Sunday. "It didn't look like a confrontation, but the conversation seemed serious," Pickett stated, adding a confusing element to the investigation. Meanwhile, at the Washington home, the weight of absence was becoming increasingly unbearable. Eliza, sitting in the living room surrounded by church members who brought food and offered support, held the framed photo from her wedding day. "He would never abandon his family or his church," she repeated to a reporter from the Birmingham Post-Herald, who had taken an interest in the case. "Something terrible happened to my James. He was so happy with the doctorate, so excited about the new programs for the church, and he would never, ever leave his children without a word." 7 days after the disappearance, Detective Miller presented the family with a disturbing discovery. 2 months earlier, James had received an anonymous letter with newspaper clippings forming the message, "Blacks and whites separated as God planned. Preachers who confuse the plan pay the price." James had mentioned the letter to Deacon Wilson, but decided not to alarm Eliza or the authorities, considering it just another empty intimidation. The discovery of the threatening letter transformed the tone of the investigation. Detective Miller's weathered face turned grave as he examined the letter with gloved hands in his office early the next morning. The message, crafted from newspaper clippings, was unmistakably a threat, one that James had deemed not serious enough to report. "This changes everything," Miller muttered, asking a technician to check for fingerprints. What had initially been treated as a mysterious disappearance now carried the dark possibility of targeted violence. Later that afternoon, Miller sat across from Dr. Harrison in the dean's oak-paneled university office. Sunlight streamed through Venetian blinds, casting striped shadows across the detective's notepad. "I need specific names, Dr. Harrison. Who seemed particularly disturbed by James's speech? Who reacted negatively? Even subtle reactions could be important." Harrison removed his glasses, rubbing the bridge of his nose. There were a few uncomfortable faces, particularly during his comments about churches leading integration efforts. "The Simmons brothers were there. Richard is your police chief, I believe. His brother Harold pastors that all-white church in Riverdale." Neither looked pleased. Back at the Washington home, Eliza sat on the edge of the bed she had shared with James for 18 years. Her 3 children gathered around her as she held James's glasses, recovered from his abandoned car. The thick lenses caught the afternoon light. "Your father received this threat 2 months ago," she explained, her voice steady despite her trembling hands. "He mentioned it to Deacon Wilson, but decided not to tell me or report it to the police. He was protecting us, trying not to worry us." Michael's jaw tightened. "He should have reported it. The police might have taken precautions." "Your father believed it was just another empty threat," Eliza replied. "He'd received others over the years." The following day, Miller interviewed Arnold Pickett in a small interrogation room at the police station. The 60-year-old fisherman shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his weathered hands fidgeting with his cap. "I was loading my boat around 6 that evening," Pickett explained. "Saw the Reverend talking with 2 white men in the parking lot. Didn't look like they were fighting, but they weren't just passing the time of day either. The conversation looked serious." "Can you describe these men?" Miller pressed. "Medium height, one stocky with a beard, the other thinner, wearing a baseball cap. Both in their 40s, I'd guess." Throughout the week, members of New Hope Baptist Church continued their searches along Lake Martin's shores. They moved in organized lines through the underbrush, some with binoculars scanning the water, others calling James's name. Deacon Wilson coordinated their efforts with a megaphone, his deep voice carrying instructions across the search area. "Check every cove. Look under fallen trees along the shore," Wilson directed, his usually composed demeanor showing signs of strain. The church community had become a search party, their Sunday best replaced by work clothes and hiking boots. The following Monday, Miller was in his office, studying photographs of known Klan members in the area, when Police Chief Richard Simmons entered without knocking. Simmons, a heavy-set man with thinning hair and perpetually ruddy cheeks, closed the door behind him. "Frank, I hear you're pursuing this hate crime angle pretty hard," Simmons said, his tone conversational, but his eyes cold. "Are you sure that's productive? Most likely the Reverend had an accident or maybe even walked away from his responsibilities. Happens more often than people think." Miller met his superior's gaze steadily. "I follow the evidence, Chief. And right now, that threatening letter is the strongest lead we have." Later that afternoon, Michael Washington confronted Miller in the family's living room, his teenage face tight with anger and fear. "If my father were a prominent white man who disappeared, you'd have helicopters and 50 officers searching. Instead, you're scaling back after just 1 week?" Miller didn't flinch at the accusation. "I understand your frustration, Michael, but I promise you, I'm giving this case everything I've got." Upstairs, Sarah had locked herself in her room for the 3rd consecutive day. Eliza sat on the floor outside her daughter's door, speaking softly through the wood. "Sarah, honey, I know you're scared. I am too. But we need to be strong for each other now. Your father would want us to face this together." Only silence answered her. That Sunday, New Hope Baptist Church was filled beyond capacity. Deacon Wilson stood at the pulpit, his usual position behind and to the right of Reverend Washington, now replaced by a central role he never wanted. "Our pastor is missing, but our faith must not be," Wilson told the congregation, his voice wavering slightly. "Reverend Washington taught us that in times of greatest darkness, our light must shine brightest." In the days that followed, Miller discovered something troubling in James's phone records. A 17-minute call, received 3 days before his disappearance, originating from a payphone at a gas station near Riverdale. The investigation continued to yield small, disconnected pieces of information. Outside the viewpoint where James's car had been found, Miller encountered young Joshua Washington one afternoon. The 13-year-old boy had been riding his bicycle around the area, his own quiet investigation underway. "Do you think my father is alive, Detective Miller?" Joshua asked, his voice small but determined. Miller crouched to meet the boy's eyes. "I'm doing everything I can to find him, son. Your father is an important man, and we're not giving up." 2 weeks after the disappearance, Chief Simmons called a press conference in the station's lobby. Under the harsh fluorescent lights, He announced that while the case remained open, the intensive search operations would be scaled back. "We'll continue to follow leads as they emerge," Simmons stated, "but we must also be realistic about allocating resources." The announcement was met with immediate protest from community members present. Shouts of "cover up" and "racism" echoed through the lobby. That night, Miller sat at his dining room table, case photos spread before him. His wife placed a cup of coffee by his elbow, resting her hand briefly on his shoulder. "You're not going to let this one go, are you, Frank?" she asked quietly. Miller shook his head, studying a photograph of James's car at the viewpoint. "Something doesn't add up, Claire. Washington was too devoted to his family and church to just vanish, and too smart to be taken easily." At 2:17 that morning, Miller's home phone rang, startling him awake. He fumbled for the receiver in the darkness. "Detective Miller," he answered, his voice rough with sleep. "Look in the depths of the lake, Detective," a disguised voice whispered. "Some secrets sink and disappear forever." Before Miller could respond, the call ended, leaving only the sound of wind and what seemed to be a church bell tolling in the background. Miller played the anonymous call recording for the third time in his office at 6 in the morning. The technical aspects specialist, Tom Griffith, adjusted his headphones, concentrating on the background sounds. "That bell, it has a distinctive tone," Griffith said, making notes. "I think it's the Riverdale Episcopal. They have that unique bronze bell from the 1800s. Not many churches around here with that particular resonance." Miller rubbed his tired eyes. Riverdale again. That can't be coincidence. He gathered his notes and headed straight to Chief Simmons' office, determined to push for a more thorough search of the lake. Standing before his superior's desk, Miller laid out his case. "We need professional divers to explore the deeper areas of the lake, especially the ravine, about 2 miles from the viewpoint. I have reason to believe there might be evidence there." Simmons leaned back in his chair, skepticism written across his face. "Frank, we've already searched the shorelines extensively. Resources are limited, and I can't justify allocating more manpower based on an anonymous call that could easily be a hoax." "What if it's not a hoax?" Miller pressed. "What if someone knows something but is afraid to come forward officially?" Back at the Washington home, Eliza sat at the kitchen table surrounded by unpaid bills, calculator in hand. The stack of envelopes grew taller each day. Mortgage, utilities, medical insurance. Without James's income from the church, their savings would only stretch so far. Michael entered the kitchen, his young face showing a determination beyond his years. "Mom, I've made a decision," he said, sitting across from her. "I'm going to defer college and work full-time at Henderson's Hardware. Mr. Henderson already offered me the job." Eliza looked up sharply. "Michael, your education—" "Dad always said family comes first," Michael interrupted gently. "I can go to college next year, or the year after. Right now, we need stability." 3 days later, Miller finally secured approval for a limited diving operation. The fire department's dive team assembled at the lake's edge, checking their equipment as Miller spread a map across the hood of his car. "Focus on this ravine area," he instructed, pointing to a marked section approximately 2 miles from the viewpoint. "It drops to nearly 100 feet depth. If something, or someone, was disposed of in the lake, this would be an ideal location." At New Hope Baptist Church, Deacon Wilson sat with the church council in the small conference room adjacent to the sanctuary. The mood was somber as they discussed practical matters. "It's been a month," said Elder Johnson, the oldest member of the council. "We need to consider a more permanent arrangement for church leadership." Wilson nodded reluctantly. "I understand, but I'm still hopeful that Reverend Washington will return to us." "We all pray for that," Johnson replied gently, "but the congregation needs stability. Attendance is already down 15%, and the food bank is struggling without his fundraising skills." In the Washington home, Sarah wandered into Joshua's bedroom and found her younger brother sitting cross-legged on the floor, surrounded by detective novels and true crime books borrowed from the public library. "What are you doing, Josh?" she asked, sitting on the edge of his bed. Joshua looked up, his eyes intense. trying to understand how to solve mysteries. Maybe I can find something the police missed. A notebook beside him was filled with meticulous notes in a 13-year-old's handwriting. Times, locations, people's names drawn from newspaper articles about their father's case. That afternoon, Miller reviewed the photographs of James's car again, this time with a magnifying glass. Something had been bothering him about the scene, and suddenly he saw it. Subtle drag marks in the gravel near the vehicle, previously dismissed as tire tracks. They suggested something, or someone, had been pulled from the car to another location. At 3:45, one of the divers emerged from the water, holding a small evidence bag. Miller's heart raced as he approached the shoreline. "Found this embedded in silt near the bottom of the ravine," the diver explained, handing over the bag. Inside was a fountain pen, its once elegant surface now corroded by lake water. But the initials JW remained visible, etched into the metal barrel. The next day, Eliza sat across from Miller in his office, carefully examining the pen. Her fingers trembled slightly as she turned it over. "James received this when he graduated from Morehouse," she confirmed, her voice barely above a whisper. "He carried it everywhere. Said it reminded him of how far he'd come and how much further our people needed to go." While the discovery of the pen renewed the investigation's momentum, Miller was growing increasingly suspicious of internal obstruction. Working late one night, he began quietly investigating Chief Simmons himself, discovering through department records that Simmons had a cousin who had participated in Klan rallies throughout the 60s. "This goes deeper than I thought," Miller muttered to himself, carefully documenting his findings in a personal notebook rather than the official case file. That night, Eliza was awakened by Joshua's screams. She rushed to his room to find him sitting upright in bed, his face streaked with tears. "I dreamed about Dad, Mom," he sobbed as she held him. "He was trying to talk to me from underwater. He couldn't breathe, but he was trying to tell me something important." Eliza rocked her youngest child, her own tears falling silently. "It was just a dream, baby, just a dream." 1 month after James's disappearance, New Hope Baptist Church held a candlelight vigil. Hundreds of candles illuminated the sanctuary, their flickering light casting moving shadows across the walls. The front pew, traditionally reserved for the pastor, remained empty except for James's Bible placed carefully on the cushion. 2 days after the vigil, Miller made an unannounced visit to Robert Fletcher's home, catching the man as he returned from work. "Mr. Fletcher," Miller said, standing in Fletcher's driveway, "I believe you know more than you've told me. The Reverend's pen was found in the lake, in a very deep part that someone would have to know well to choose as a disposal site." Fletcher's face remained impassive, but Miller noted how his hands gripped his car keys tighter. "I don't know what you're talking about, Detective. Now, if you'll excuse me, I'm tired after a long day." That evening, Eliza sat alone in James's untouched home office. The room remained exactly as he had left it that Sunday morning. Sermon notes neatly stacked, his favorite theological texts arranged on the desk, family photos smiling from every surface. "I don't know how much longer I can do this, James," she whispered to his photograph on the desk. "The boys need their father. Sarah is shutting down. Please, give me some sign." Upon returning home from the church vigil, Eliza found a brown envelope with no return address on her porch. Inside was a black and white photograph showing James being approached by 2 men in the Viewpoint parking lot. On the back, written in block letters, "Ask Thomas Kingsley and Bill Durant." Eliza's hands trembled as she examined the photograph under the bright kitchen light, Miller leaning in beside her. The black and white image clearly showed James being approached by 2 men in the Viewpoint parking lot, the timestamp in the corner reading 6:15 in the evening of June 17th. "How could someone have taken this and waited 2 months to send it?" Eliza asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Miller shook his head, examining the handwriting on the back. Someone who was afraid, or someone who was involved, and is now having second thoughts. He carefully placed the photograph in an evidence bag. "I need to run background checks on these names immediately." The following morning, Miller sat at his desk, printouts of criminal records spread before him. Thomas Kingsley, 48, and William Durant, 52, both with records of misdemeanor arrests for disorderly conduct at anti-integration protests in the late 60s. More troubling were their documented ties to Klan activities, though neither had been formally charged with hate crimes. Miller gathered his findings and headed straight to Chief Simmons' office, knocking briskly before entering. He placed the photograph on the desk, along with the background information he'd compiled. "We need to bring them in for formal questioning," Miller stated firmly. "This is the first concrete lead linking specific individuals to Reverend Washington's disappearance." Simmons leaned back in his chair, his expression guarded. "Frank, do you have any idea what will happen if we drag in two white men based on an anonymous photograph? This community is already on edge. We need more than this." "This isn't just some random lead," Miller argued. "These men have histories of racial antagonism. They were at the lake when James disappeared. We can't ignore this." "I'm not saying ignore it," Simmons replied coolly. "I'm saying build a stronger case first. Get more evidence, something that will stand up in court. Otherwise, we're just reopening old racial wounds for nothing." Later that afternoon, Michael Washington crouched in his car across the street from Kingsley's auto repair shop. He'd been observing the location for 3 hours, meticulously noting when employees arrived and left, when customers came by, and particularly watching Kingsley's interactions. In a small notebook, he recorded timestamps and brief observations, determined to find something the police might have missed. Across town, Eliza sat in her car outside Durant's modest ranch-style home, her heart pounding in her chest. She had driven there on impulse, after leaving the grocery store, drawn by an overwhelming need to confront one of the men who might know what happened to her husband. Her hand was on the door handle when a familiar voice called her name. "Eliza, what are you doing here?" Deacon Wilson approached her car, concern etched on his face. "I need answers, Thomas," she said, her voice breaking. "These men know what happened to James." Wilson gently placed his hand on hers. "Not like this, Eliza. You could be putting yourself in danger. These men, if they did what we suspect, wouldn't hesitate to harm you too." The following day, Miller appeared before Judge Carlton, seeking a warrant to formally interrogate Kingsley and Durant. The judge adjusted his glasses as he reviewed the materials, his expression growing increasingly skeptical. "An anonymous photograph doesn't constitute probable cause, Detective," he said, handing the documents back. "Anyone could have taken this picture and written these names. Bring me something substantial, forensic evidence, credible witness testimony, anything that would stand up to scrutiny." Miller left the courthouse frustrated but undeterred. If he couldn't proceed officially, he would find another way to get the truth. At the public library, Joshua Washington hunched over microfilm readers, methodically going through old newspaper archives documenting racial violence cases in Alabama. The elderly librarian, Mr. Perkins, quietly provided additional resources, placing them beside the boy. "My father knew your father," he said softly. "He was a good man. If there's anything in these records that might help, you'll find it." Meanwhile, Sarah finally emerged from her self-imposed isolation, helping to organize a support group for young people dealing with loss at the church. "Dad always said helping others is the best way to handle your own pain," she explained to the small group gathered in the church basement. Her voice was hesitant at first, but grew stronger as she spoke. 2 months after James's disappearance, the Birmingham Police Department held a formal meeting to reassess ongoing investigations. Despite Miller's protests, the Washington case was officially reclassified as a routine investigation with significantly reduced resources allocated to it. The community responded with outrage. That weekend, hundreds marched to Birmingham City Hall, carrying placards with James's photograph and the words, "Where is justice for Reverend Washington?" The peaceful demonstration received local news coverage but was largely ignored by wider media outlets. After the case reclassification, Miller confronted Simmons in the hallway outside his office. "You're deliberately burying this investigation," he said, keeping his voice low but intense. Simmons stepped closer, his expression hardening. Be careful, Frank. You're a few years from retirement. It would be a shame to lose your pension over a case that's going nowhere. That evening, Eliza discovered Michael at the dining room table, surrounded by maps of the city and notes about Kingsley and Durant. He looked up as she entered, his young face a mixture of determination and exhaustion. "Mom, I think I'm onto something," he said, pointing to his notes. "These men, they're all connected through First Baptist Church of Riverdale. They attend the same men's prayer breakfasts, the same church events. And guess who else is part of that congregation?" "Who?" Eliza asked, sitting beside him. "Chief Simmons' brother, Reverend Harold Simmons." The following Sunday, Miller visited First Baptist Church of Riverdale, an all-white congregation housed in an imposing brick building. After the service, he lingered in the fellowship hall, examining photographs of church events displayed on a bulletin board. In several pictures, he noted Kingsley, Durant, and Reverend Harold Simmons together. In one particular photo from a church picnic the previous summer, Chief Simmons stood alongside them, arm around his brother's shoulders. That night, the Washington family gathered around their dining table, having a conversation they had been avoiding for weeks. "Maybe it's time we consider holding a memorial service for Dad," Michael suggested carefully. "Not a funeral, but something to honor him." "That sounds like giving up," Joshua protested. "It's not giving up," Michael replied. "It's recognizing that whatever happened, Dad would want us to move forward." While investigating quietly at First Baptist Church of Riverdale, later that week, Miller was approached by an elderly janitor who had been watching him from a distance. The man glanced nervously around the empty hallway before leaning closer. "I was cleaning the parish hall on the night of June 17th, when Kingsley, Durant, and Fletcher arrived covered in mud and water, looking panicked," he whispered. "Reverend Simmons, your chief's brother, locked himself in with them for hours." Miller stood frozen in the church hallway, the janitor's revelation sending his mind racing. This was the connection he had been searching for, direct evidence placing the suspects together with the chief's brother on the very night of James's disappearance. "Mr. Carter, I need to know everything you saw and heard that night," Miller said, guiding the elderly man to a quiet corner. "Would you be willing to make a formal statement?" Benjamin Carter, 72 years old with arthritic hands that trembled slightly, looked around nervously. "They'd know it was me. I need this job, detective. But I can't keep silent anymore. Not with what I saw." The following morning, Miller sat in Carter's small apartment on the outskirts of Birmingham. The modest space was meticulously clean, filled with photographs of children and grandchildren. Carter spoke in a low voice, as if afraid of being overheard even here. "They came in through the back entrance around 11 that night. I was mopping the fellowship hall. They didn't see me at first. I was in the supply closet. Kingsley's pants were wet up to the knees, and Durant had mud all over his boots. Fletcher looked the worst. His hands were scratched up, and there was something dark on his shirt that could have been blood." Miller recorded every detail, his experience telling him this was the breakthrough he'd been waiting for. Later that day, he began researching Reverend Harold Simmons, discovering recorded sermons with thinly veiled racist rhetoric, and photographs of him with known Klan leaders at community preservation rallies. 3 days later, Miller was summoned to Chief Simmons' office. The chief's expression was thunderous as Miller entered. "Frank, you're officially removed from the Washington case," Simmons announced without preamble. "Insubordination and harassment of respected citizens based on hearsay and rumors. Officer Peters will take over the investigation effective immediately." "You can't do this," Miller protested. "I'm close to breaking this case wide open." "It's done," Simmons replied coldly. "Clean out your desk of any personal materials related to this case by the end of the day." Miller stood in the bullpen, emptying his desk while colleagues averted their eyes, uncomfortable with the public humiliation of a respected veteran. As he was packing his personal effects, a young black officer named Roberts approached cautiously. "My mother attends New Hope," he said quietly. "If you need anything, information, access to files, let me know. This isn't right." That Sunday, Eliza attended the 3-month memorial service at New Hope Baptist Church. The congregation had diminished noticeably since James's disappearance, but those who remained were the faithful core. Eliza had been adamant about the nature of the service. "This is a service of hope, not a funeral," she had told Deacon Wilson firmly. "No casket, no symbolic burial. James may still come home to us." Meanwhile, Michael sat nervously in the manager's office of Henderson's warehouse, interviewing for a full-time position. The manager, Mr. Henderson, reviewed his application with raised eyebrows. "These grades are exceptional, son. I thought you'd be heading to college with marks like these." Michael straightened in his chair. "Family circumstances have changed, sir. I need to help support my mother and siblings right now." That evening, Miller transformed his basement into an unofficial investigation headquarters. He pinned photographs, documents, and maps to the walls, connecting suspects with red string. His wife watched from the doorway, concern etched on her face. "Frank, are you sure about this? You're risking everything." "Claire, I can't let this go," he replied, not looking up from his work. "That family deserves the truth, and someone in the department is actively blocking it." At New Hope Baptist Church, the financial situation was becoming dire. The church council gathered around the conference table, reviewing the grim numbers. "The scholarship program will have to be suspended this year," Elder Johnson announced reluctantly. "Without Reverend Washington, donations have dropped dramatically. We're barely covering operational costs." The following week, Sarah was walking home from school when she overheard a group of white students making crude jokes about her father's disappearance. Something inside her snapped. "My father disappeared because he stood up for people like you too," she shouted, confronting them directly. "He believed in integration and equality for everyone. That's why he's gone." The students fell silent, some looking ashamed, others defiant. Sarah walked away with her head high, tears streaming down her face, but feeling stronger than she had in months. Miller began conducting surveillance on Kingsley during his off hours, photographing him meeting with Reverend Harold Simmons at an isolated diner outside town. The two men spoke intensely for over an hour, their body language suggesting a serious discussion. One afternoon, Joshua discovered Michael's investigation notes hidden under his brother's mattress while looking for a borrowed book. The detailed observations of Durant and Kingsley's movements, handwritten maps, and timeline theories fascinated the 13-year-old. "I want to help," Joshua told Michael that evening, presenting the notes. "Two pairs of eyes are better than one." Michael was initially angry about the invasion of privacy, but soon relented, recognizing his brother's need to do something, anything, to feel less helpless. Tensions escalated at the Washington home when Eliza discovered Michael had formally deferred his college acceptance. "Your father sacrificed everything so you could have this opportunity," she cried, waving the deferment letter. "Education was everything to him. And I'm sacrificing so we can survive, Mom," Michael shouted back. "Someone has to pay the bills. The church can barely help anymore, and your teacher's salary isn't enough." Meanwhile, Miller convinced Officer Roberts to discreetly check police records from the night of June 17th. "Look for any reported incident near Lake Martin, even something seemingly unrelated," he instructed. Deacon Wilson approached Eliza after Sunday service with a proposal. "James always said you were as capable as he was of leading," he said gently. "The congregation needs stability. Would you consider taking a more active role?" As Miller continued his unofficial investigation, he discovered that Robert Fletcher had sold his fishing boat 2 weeks after James's disappearance, despite being an avid fisherman his entire life, a detail overlooked in the original investigation. As the memorial service concluded, Officer Roberts pulled Miller into a corner of the church and discreetly handed over a copy of a filed report. In the early hours of June 18th, a highway patrolman had reported a blue Ford pickup with 3 white men stopped on the road near Lake Martin at 2:13 in the morning, with fishing equipment and soaking wet clothes. The responding officer who dismissed the case without investigation was Richard Simmons, then a patrol sergeant. Miller stared at the police report in his hands, pulse quickening as he processed its implications. The document placed all three suspects together near Lake Martin just hours after James's disappearance, and more damningly, showed that Richard Simmons himself had intervened to dismiss the incident without investigation. "This connects all the dots, Roberts," Miller whispered, careful to keep his voice down even in the empty church corner. "They were together, by the lake, wet and agitated, and Simmons buried the report." Officer Roberts nodded gravely. "I can't access it through official channels anymore. This copy was buried in archived incident reports, misfiled under routine traffic stops. Someone deliberately made it hard to find." The next morning, Miller drove to Madison County to visit a used boat dealer where Fletcher had sold his fishing vessel. The small showroom smelled of fiberglass and motor oil as Miller approached the owner, showing a photograph of Fletcher's boat from a fishing tournament the previous year. "Yeah, I remember that sale," the dealer said, scratching his stubbled chin. "Odd timing. Guy had just won the county base tournament with that boat 3 weeks earlier. Came in saying he needed to sell fast, took nearly $5,000 less than it was worth. Said he was moving to Texas suddenly for work." Back in Oakwood, Eliza had returned to her first-grade classroom at Oakwood Elementary. 25 small faces looked up at her with undisguised curiosity as she wrote her name on the chalkboard, her hand steady despite her inner turmoil. "Mrs. Washington, where were you?" asked a small girl in the front row. "Mrs. Peterson said you were sad because you lost someone." Eliza took a deep breath. "Yes, Ruby. I was away because my husband is missing, but I've missed all of you, and I'm happy to be back teaching." That evening, Michael arrived home exhausted from his warehouse job, muscles aching from moving inventory for 10 hours straight. He found Joshua sprawled on the living room floor, surrounded by detailed maps of Lake Martin, drawing lines and making notations. "What are you doing, little brother?" Michael asked, dropping his lunchbox on the coffee table. Joshua looked up, his eyes intense with concentration. "I'm mapping every possible route from the viewpoint to the deepest parts of the lake. If someone wanted to dispose of evidence or a person, where would they go?" 6 months after James's disappearance, New Hope Baptist Church held another memorial service. The congregation had dwindled to about half its former size, the atmosphere more resigned than the raw grief of earlier gatherings. The front pew remained empty, a silent testament to their missing pastor. Following the service, Miller noticed a police cruiser following him as he drove home, not openly tailing him, but consistently appearing in his rearview mirror at turns and intersections. He took a deliberate detour, confirming his suspicions when the unmarked car continued to follow. Discreetly, he noted the license plate number. At the church youth center, Sarah had found unexpected purpose leading a support group for teenagers. "For 2 months, I could barely get out of bed," she admitted to the circle of young people. "I was angry at God, at the police, at everyone. But I've discovered that helping others with their pain eases my own a little." One Tuesday afternoon, Miller drove to Fletcher's auto shop, only to find it closed, a "For Sale, Contact Riverdale Realty" sign hanging on the chain-link fence. A neighboring business owner watering plants outside offered information without prompting. "Left in the middle of the night about 2 weeks ago," the man said. "Told everyone he was moving to Texas to be closer to his daughter. Strange, though. Never mentioned having family there before." At the school office, Eliza received her first paycheck after months without income. Her hands trembled slightly as she looked at the amount, modest, but enough to start addressing the backlog of bills that had accumulated. "Now I can pay the overdue electric bill," she murmured to herself, relief washing over her face. That evening, Miller parked his car across from First Baptist Church of Riverdale, observing Durant enter for an evening meeting with Reverend Harold Simmons. Through his camera's telephoto lens, he photographed them greeting each other with the familiarity of long association. Meanwhile, Joshua spent hours at the public library, researching missing persons cases in Alabama, making meticulous notes in a composition book. The reference librarian, recognizing his dedication, quietly provided additional resources without comment. Growing increasingly paranoid, Miller began noticing strange clicks and intermittent static on his home phone, suggesting it might be tapped. He started using payphones for sensitive calls, particularly when contacting Officer Roberts. After weeks of gathering evidence independently, Miller decided it was time to share everything with the Washington family. The tense meeting in their living room stretched late into the night as Miller laid out his unofficial investigation, spreading photographs, documents, and timelines across their coffee table. "The department is actively obstructing this case," Miller explained grimly. "We need to work together, outside the system, if we're ever going to find the truth." Michael's face darkened with anger as the evidence mounted. "So the police are covering up my father's murder? And you want us to trust you, a cop?" "I understand your skepticism," Miller replied, reaching into his briefcase for his complete file of evidence. "I'm risking my career, my pension, maybe even my safety. But James deserves justice, and you deserve the truth." By the meeting's end, even Michael had reluctantly accepted Miller's sincerity, and they had formulated a plan to continue the investigation cooperatively. The following morning, Miller walked to his car parked outside his modest home, stopping short at the sight that greeted him. All 4 tires had been slashed, and tucked under the windshield wiper was a note on familiar paper. "Stop digging, or you'll be the next to disappear." The same font and paper type as the original threat sent to James months before his disappearance. Miller stared at the threatening note, his police instincts kicking in despite the shock. He carefully photographed the slashed tires and the note in situ, documenting every detail before touching anything. The message was unmistakable. He was getting too close to the truth, and someone wanted him silenced. Later that morning, Miller walked into the police station, note in an evidence bag. The bullpen fell unusually quiet as he approached the desk sergeant. "I need to file a report for vandalism and criminal threats," he stated firmly, placing the evidence on the counter. Officer Wilkins, a 20-year veteran, glanced at the note, then back at Miller with undisguised skepticism. "You sure this isn't just some prank, Frank? Kids these days have no respect." "This is the exact same paper and font as the threat sent to Reverend Washington before his disappearance," Miller replied, keeping his voice level despite his rising frustration. "I'm still a citizen entitled to police protection, even if I'm investigating a case some people want buried." Across town, a reporter from the Birmingham Post-Herald sat in the Washington living room, notebook open as Eliza spoke with quiet dignity. "As we approach 1 year since my husband's disappearance, we remain committed to finding the truth. James was a man dedicated to his family, his congregation, and his principles. That dedication didn't simply vanish." The reporter, a young woman named Rebecca Collins, had taken a special interest in the case, frustrated by her editor's reluctance to give it prominent coverage. "Mrs. Washington, has there been any recent development in the investigation that gives you hope?" Eliza's eyes briefly flickered toward Michael, who gave an almost imperceptible shake of his head. "Just our continued faith," she answered carefully. 2 days later, Miller received devastating news through his law enforcement contacts in Texas. Robert Fletcher, whose sudden relocation had raised red flags, had died in a single-vehicle accident on a deserted stretch of highway outside of Houston. According to the report, his truck had veered off the road at high speed with no signs of braking. No witnesses, no passengers, just another unfortunate traffic fatality. "This is no coincidence," Miller told Officer Roberts as they met discreetly in a diner 20 miles outside Birmingham. "Fletcher was a key witness, possibly ready to crack under pressure. Now he's conveniently silenced forever." Roberts nodded grimly. "The Texas report mentions his blood alcohol level was twice the legal limit. Perfect cover. Who questions a drunk driving fatality?" As the first anniversary of James's disappearance approached, preparations for a memorial service intensified. In the church office, Deacon Wilson and Eliza discussed the format of the event. "We should call it a service of hope and remembrance," Eliza insisted. "Not a funeral, Thomas. I cannot, will not, hold a funeral without certainty." Wilson nodded. Understanding the distinction was crucial for her. The Birmingham Post-Herald wants to cover it. They're planning a feature on James's legacy and the unresolved investigation. That evening, tensions erupted in the Washington home as the family debated their next steps. Michael pounded the dining table, his patience finally exhausted. "We need to contact the FBI. This local investigation is completely compromised," he shouted, frustration evident in every word. "It's been a year, and we're no closer to justice because the very people supposed to investigate are the ones covering it up." Eliza reached across the table, grasping his hand. "Michael, Detective Miller is our best chance. If we alienate him now—" "Miller has no authority anymore," Michael interrupted. "He's just one retired cop against an entire department of corruption." From the kitchen doorway, Sarah watched the argument unfold, her expression troubled. Later that night, Eliza found her daughter in her bedroom, college catalogs spread across her bed. "Planning your future?" Eliza asked softly, sitting on the edge of the mattress. Sarah nodded, not meeting her mother's eyes. "I can't stay in Birmingham forever, Mom. I can't keep being the missing pastor's daughter everywhere I go. I want to apply to schools in Nashville, start fresh somewhere new." Eliza felt a pang of both understanding and loss. Her family was slowly being pulled apart by the gravity of James's absence. Meanwhile, Joshua's obsession with solving his father's disappearance had intensified. Miller found himself simultaneously concerned and impressed when the boy showed him his bedroom investigation wall, photos, newspaper clippings, and maps connected with red yarn, eerily similar to Miller's own basement setup. "I've been tracking the movements of Durant and Chief Simmons," Joshua explained, pointing to a calendar with meticulous notations. "They meet every Thursday at Riverdale Diner, always in the back booth, always for exactly 47 minutes. On the Sunday marking 1 year since James's disappearance, New Hope Baptist Church was filled beyond capacity. Over 400 people attended, including local officials and representatives from churches across the state. The first pew remained symbolically empty, James's Bible placed on the cushion. Miller observed the ceremony from the back, noting with professional interest a man he recognized as a police informant taking notes. The detective's presence did not go unnoticed. When Chief Simmons entered the church in what appeared to be a gesture of community support, Michael immediately confronted him. "How dare you show your face here when you're actively obstructing the investigation?" Michael's voice carried through the hushed sanctuary, causing heads to turn. Following the service, Miller discovered his retirement file had been flagged for administrative review, a clear warning that his pension could be in jeopardy if he continued his investigation. That afternoon, Eliza made a significant decision. As the children's choir rehearsed for the next Sunday service, she approached Deacon Wilson. "Let the children sit in the front pew from now on," she said quietly. "James always said the future belongs to the children." 3 days later, Miller discovered that Thomas Kingsley had listed his house for sale and appeared to be preparing to leave the state, suggesting the conspirators were systematically disappearing. After leaving the memorial service, Miller drove cautiously through the darkening streets of Birmingham, his mind processing everything he had observed. In his rearview mirror, he noticed a police cruiser that had been following him for several blocks. Suddenly, it flashed its lights, signaling him to pull over. As he complied and stepped out of his vehicle, Miller recognized the two officers as Simmons' close associates, immediately realizing this was no routine traffic stop. "Get in the car, Frank," said Officer Brennan, his hand resting meaningfully on his holster. "The chief wants to have a private conversation about your early retirement." Miller's stomach tightened as he was escorted into the unmarked police car. The officers said nothing during the 15-minute drive to a remote municipal golf course, closed for the day. In the empty parking lot, Chief Simmons leaned against his personal vehicle, arms crossed, waiting. "Let's make this simple, Frank," Simmons said as Miller was brought before him. 30 years of service, full retirement benefits, lifetime health coverage. All you need to do is leave the past in the past. Miller studied the man he'd worked alongside for decades. You mean forget that James Washington was murdered and you helped cover it up? Simmons's expression hardened. I'm offering you a dignified exit. The alternative isn't pretty. Fabricated misconduct charges, loss of pension, public humiliation. Is this crusade really worth throwing away everything you've worked for? Some things matter more than a pension, Richard, Miller replied steadily. Justice matters. Truth matters. 2 days later, Miller stood in the precinct bullpen, surrendering his badge and service weapon to Captain Reynolds. The formal suspension letter cited insubordination and pursuit of unauthorized investigations. Colleagues averted their eyes as Miller emptied his desk, all except Officer Roberts, who approached and firmly shook his hand. This isn't right, Roberts said quietly. Many of us know it. That evening, Miller sat in the Washington's living room explaining his suspension. In some ways, this frees me, he told the family. I can investigate openly now, without pretending to follow department protocols. No more looking over my shoulder inside the station. Eliza nodded slowly, processing this latest development. But without your badge, without access to police resources, I still have contacts. Roberts will help from inside, and now I can pursue leads that would have been off limits to me as an active officer. 2 weeks later, Michael stood in the kitchen holding his deferred college acceptance letter, watching his mother prepare dinner. You were right, Mom, he said quietly. Dad would want me to go. I've arranged to start law school next fall. Eliza wiped her hands on her apron and embraced her eldest son. He would be so proud, Michael, so very proud. During a tense family dinner the following evening, Sarah cleared her throat nervously. I've decided to apply to pre-med programs in Nashville, she announced, watching her family's reactions carefully. Vanderbilt has an excellent program. Joshua's fork clattered against his plate. You're abandoning the search for Dad? You're giving up on him? I'm not giving up, Sarah shot back, tears welling in her eyes. Eliza intervened before the argument escalated. Nobody is giving up on your father, Joshua. But he wouldn't want us to put our lives on hold indefinitely. He always said that life must continue, especially in the face of tragedy. She reached across the table, squeezing Joshua's hand. Your father believed in building futures. That's what Sarah and Michael are trying to do. Throughout March, Miller, now sporting a beard and civilian clothes, conducted surveillance on William Durant. For 3 consecutive nights, he followed Durant to different bars around Birmingham, watching as the man drank heavily, his behavior growing increasingly erratic. On the 4th night, Miller positioned himself on the adjacent bar stool at the Rusty Nail, a dimly lit establishment on the outskirts of town. He ordered a beer and sat silently until Durant, already intoxicated, initiated conversation. Rough day? Miller asked sympathetically, maintaining his cover as just another patron seeking solace in alcohol. Durant stared into his whiskey. You don't know nothing. Some burdens are too heavy to carry. He took another long swallow. That damn preacher should have stayed in his place. Miller felt his pulse quicken, but kept his expression neutral. His hand moved casually to his jacket pocket, confirming that the small tape recorder was running. Preacher? He prompted gently. Some people don't understand their place in the natural order, Durant continued, words slurring. Accidents happen when folks step out of line. Just as Durant seemed on the verge of revealing more, he suddenly clutched his chest, his face contorting in pain. The whiskey glass slipped from his fingers, shattering on the floor as he collapsed from the bar stool. Someone call an ambulance, Miller shouted, kneeling beside Durant to check for a pulse. He found one, weak and erratic. 3 hours later, Miller sat in the hospital waiting room, hoping Durant would stabilize enough for questioning. A middle-aged nurse with a somber expression approached him. Are you here for Mr. Durant? She asked quietly. Miller nodded, rising to his feet. I'm sorry. He didn't survive the heart attack. Back home, Miller played the recording repeatedly, frustrated by its tantalizing vagueness. Durant's confession, if it could even be called that, was insufficient evidence, but confirmed what Miller already suspected. Now another potential witness was permanently silenced. 3 years had passed since James Washington's disappearance. New Hope Baptist Church, once vibrant and growing under his leadership, had diminished considerably. Many congregants had drifted to other churches, uncomfortable with the unresolved tragedy, or simply seeking stability elsewhere. On the third anniversary, Eliza sat in a partially filled sanctuary for a simplified memorial service. The reduced attendance was painful evidence of how time erodes even the deepest community wounds, replacing sharp grief with dull acceptance. After the service, Miller sat alone in his living room, contemplating his next move. With Fletcher dead in Texas, Durant dead from a heart attack, and Kingsley having moved away, the trail of witnesses was growing cold. The conspiracy to hide the truth about James Washington seemed to be succeeding through attrition and intimidation. The telephone's shrill ring broke his concentration. He answered wearily, expecting another dead end. "Miller, this is Thomas Kingsley." The voice sounded aged, strained. Miller sat up straight, immediately alert. "Kingsley, I've been looking for you." "I know. I'm dying of cancer, Miller. 6 months at most. I can't go to my grave carrying this. I need to tell someone what really happened at Lake Martin that night." Miller's hand tightened around the phone receiver, his heart racing at Kingsley's unexpected call. After 3 years of dead ends and obstructed justice, this could be the breakthrough he had been waiting for. "Where are you?" Miller asked, already reaching for his car keys. "Knoxville. My daughter moved me here for hospice care," Kingsley replied, his voice weak and raspy. "If you want the truth, you'd better come soon. I don't have much time left." The interstate stretched before Miller as he drove eastward the following morning, the early summer sun beating down on his weathered sedan. On the passenger seat lay several blank cassette tapes and a recorder, simple tools that might finally capture the truth about what happened to James Washington. The hills of Tennessee rose in the distance, promising answers after years of questions. The Pine Meadow Care Home sat nestled in a quiet suburb of Knoxville, its brick facade and manicured gardens belying the suffering within. A nurse with kind eyes led Miller down a hushed corridor. "He doesn't get many visitors," she confided. "Family stopped coming about a month ago. Too painful, I think." Thomas Kingsley barely resembled the robust mechanic Miller remembered from Birmingham. Cancer had hollowed his cheeks and yellowed his skin. Oxygen tubes snaked from his nostrils, and the once powerful hands that had likely struck James Washington now lay withered on the white bedsheet. "Didn't think you'd actually come, Detective," Kingsley rasped, his eyes tracking Miller as he pulled a chair beside the bed. Miller placed the recorder on the bedside table. "May I?" he asked, indicating the device. Kingsley nodded slowly. "That's why I called you. I want to confess everything before I meet my Creator. Not that I expect mercy." Miller pressed record, stating the date and time before Kingsley began his grim narrative. The dying man described how he, Fletcher, and Durant had been enraged by James's speech about racial integration. "Durant said we needed to scare him, teach him a lesson about consequences for agitators," Kingsley explained, his trembling hands plucking at the blanket. "We followed him to the viewpoint, waited until he was alone." As Kingsley continued, Miller forced himself to maintain a professional demeanor, though each detail felt like a physical blow. He described the confrontation in the parking lot, how James had refused to be intimidated. Washington didn't back down, looked Durant straight in the eye and said he was on the right side of history, that God's love didn't see color. Kingsley's voice broke. "That's when Fletcher lost it. Hit him with a baseball bat. Just meant to scare him, maybe rough him up a bit, but Fletcher always had a temper." Tears welled in Kingsley's eyes as he described the aftermath, James unconscious, bleeding profusely, and their panicked decision to cover up the assault. "There was blood everywhere. Durant said we needed to make it look like an accident. We put Washington in the back seat of his own car." Kingsley paused, fighting for breath. "We pushed it from a spot where the incline would take it straight into deep water, watched it sink, never meant for anyone to die." Miller leaned forward. "What about Chief Simmons and his brother, the Reverend Harold? What was their involvement?" Kingsley's gaze shifted to the window. "They helped with the cover-up. Harold told us it was God's will, that we were protecting the natural order." Richard made sure the investigation went nowhere. Buried evidence, redirected resources. Back in Birmingham, Michael visited his mother, bringing documents from his legal studies. His law school preparation had given him new tools to understand the systemic failures in his father's case. "I'm working on a case study that could set precedent for reopening shelved hate crime investigations," he explained, spreading papers across Eliza's kitchen table. "Professor Barnes thinks it has potential to change how cold cases involving racial motives are handled." In Nashville, Sarah sat at her desk surrounded by medical textbooks, her focus momentarily drifting to a framed photograph, her father in his white lab coat at her high school graduation party. His proud smile had once inspired her to consider medicine, a dream she was now pursuing despite the shadow of his absence. In Birmingham, Joshua and Miller pored over maps of Lake Martin, incorporating Kingsley's new information. "He said they pushed the car from this specific point," Miller explained, marking a location on the map. "Based on the incline and weight of the vehicle, we can calculate approximately where it would have sunk." Over the following week, Miller visited Kingsley 3 more times, each session revealing additional details about the conspiracy. On the final visit, Miller found Kingsley significantly weaker, barely able to speak above a whisper. "I wrote everything down," Kingsley said, gesturing to an envelope on his nightstand. "My full confession, signed and dated. Use it however you need after I'm gone." Armed with Kingsley's confession, Miller approached Birmingham's new police chief, a significantly younger man who had replaced Simmons the previous year. Chief Davenport reviewed the materials with a professional detachment that quickly turned to skepticism. "This isn't admissible in court, Frank. You know that," he said, closing the folder. "A deathbed confession obtained without counsel present, from a man on heavy painkillers, with no corroborating evidence. No prosecutor would touch this." 5 years after James's disappearance, Eliza sat in a New Hope Baptist church that bore little resemblance to the vibrant congregation her husband had once led. Membership had dwindled to less than half its former size. That Sunday, she made a decision that symbolized a subtle shift in her heart. As the service began, she nodded to Deacon Wilson, giving permission for the front pew, symbolically reserved for James all these years, to be permanently occupied by others. After a severe drought that summer, the water level in Lake Martin dropped dramatically, exposing areas of lakebed that had been submerged for decades. On a humid August morning in 1992, Ernest Cooper, a local fisherman, discovered a water-damaged Bible with the initials J.W. engraved on its leather cover, partially buried in the exposed mud of the shoreline, suddenly reviving interest in a case many had begun to forget. Ernest Cooper stood at the edge of Lake Martin, his weathered hands turning over the mud-caked Bible he had just discovered. The leather cover, though damaged by years underwater, still clearly showed the engraved initials J.W. The 67-year-old fisherman felt a chill despite the summer heat, immediately recognizing the potential significance of his find. "Dear Lord," he whispered, carefully placing the Bible in his tackle box. "That poor preacher." Within hours, news of the discovery spread through Birmingham like wildfire. Joshua Washington, now 26 and recently graduated from the Atlanta Police Academy, received the call while on patrol. "They found what?" he asked, his voice tight with emotion. "I'm coming home right now." Joshua used his new police credentials to gain immediate access to the evidence. Standing in the Birmingham Police Department, he carefully examined the Bible through its protective bag, his father's initials unmistakable on the cover. The young officer's hands trembled slightly. This was the first tangible connection to his father discovered in 13 years. The following morning, a hastily arranged press conference took place outside police headquarters. Joshua stood tall beside his mother, Eliza, whose gray hair and lined face reflected the toll of 13 years of uncertainty. Chief Davenport announced the official reopening of the investigation, acknowledging that emerging technologies might yield results impossible in 1979. "We have assembled a specialized team to conduct a thorough search of the area where the Bible was discovered," Davenport stated, cameras flashing around him. "No stone will be left unturned." 3 days later, a team with advanced sonar equipment methodically scanned the lakebed. Miller, now 70 years old with white hair but still sharp-minded, watched from the shore alongside Joshua. The sonar operator suddenly pointed at an anomaly on his screen. "We've got something at 30 meters depth," he announced. "Metal structure consistent with an automobile." The discovery sent a surge of activity through the assembled team. A specialized diving crew began preparations for a recovery operation, laying out equipment on the shoreline. Joshua stood motionless at the water's edge, Eliza's hand firmly clasped in his, as divers disappeared beneath the dark surface. Hours passed in tense anticipation. When the winch finally began to raise the corroded remains of the Chevrolet Impala, a reverent silence fell over the gathered crowd. Water cascaded from the rusted frame as it emerged from the depths, a ghost returning from the past. Forensic investigators worked with painstaking care to examine the recovered vehicle. Inside the glove compartment, they discovered James's diary, protected in makeshift waterproof wrapping, plastic bags sealed with duct tape, alongside a metal box containing documents. The interior roof of the car bore scratch marks, suggesting someone had desperately tried to escape as water filled the vehicle. That evening, the Washington family gathered in their living room, Joshua reading aloud from the recovered diary. Eliza wept silently as her son's voice gave life to her husband's final thoughts. "Received the third phone call today," Joshua read, the same voice saying that black preachers should worry about their own churches. "Decided not to tell Eliza. She has enough concerns with the children." A later entry proved even more chilling. "Found a Klan symbol painted on the church's back wall this morning before the congregation arrived. Managed to clean most of it, but this is escalating. Contacted Detective Miller privately. He suggested caution, but admitted police have limited capacity to act without concrete evidence." Eliza covered her mouth when Joshua read the final entry, dated June 17, 1979. "If something happens to me, this diary must reach the right hands." Michael, now a respected civil rights attorney, called a press conference the following week. Standing before a bank of microphones, he presented the case with the precision of a seasoned lawyer. "This was not merely an investigative failure," he stated firmly. "Evidence points to an active conspiracy to obstruct justice, involving members of local law enforcement, church leadership, and known hate group members." 2 months after the car's recovery, a forensic anthropology team confirmed that human remains found in the vehicle belonged to James Washington. Examination revealed fractures to the skull consistent with blunt force trauma, confirming Kingsley's confession about the baseball bat attack. As preparations began for a proper funeral, 40 years after James's disappearance, New Hope Baptist Church experienced a revival of sorts. The sanctuary was adorned with photographs chronicling James's life and ministry. His preserved doctoral robe lay displayed atop the casket, a symbol of the achievement that had ultimately cost him his life. On a bright Sunday in June, the church overflowed with mourners. Representatives from churches across the country joined civil rights activists, local residents, and 3 generations of the Washington family to finally bid farewell to Reverend James Washington. Joshua approached the pulpit, now a strong, confident man who had built his life around seeking justice. "My father was killed because he dared to dream of a world where churches would lead the way toward true integration," he declared, his voice carrying to the crowd outside listening through speakers. "His murder was covered up by those who feared change, but truth has finally emerged from the depths." At the cemetery, Eliza stood straight-backed beside her husband's final resting place. After 40 years of wearing her wedding ring on her left hand, waiting for a return that would never come, she slowly removed it and placed it on her right hand instead. "I'm no longer waiting for James," she explained later to her children, "but I will never stop honoring what we had." In December of 2019, 40 years after the disappearance that had defined their lives, the Washington family gathered for Christmas at Eliza's home, where a framed photograph of James stood beside a newspaper article about the newly established Truth and Reconciliation Commission, created to investigate unresolved historical civil rights crimes in Alabama, a lasting legacy of the Reverend who refused to silence his voice, even knowing the danger he faced.